Children and adolescents account for 1 out of 9 reported cases of COVID-19. According to the Unicef analysis, the UN agency calls for averting a lost generation as the pandemic threatens to cause an irreversible harm to children's education and well-being. What are the dangers of the lost year in children's education? To help answer that, Chief of Education at the Unicef, Robert Jenkins, joins me from New York. Mr. Jenkins, thank you for joining.
Good morning. Hi.
Now, the pandemic has disrupted the learning process of over 1 billion children worldwide, while it took governments and policymakers and educators a minute to be able to react to the short-term shocks and to adapt to the new changes and to make the changes. I wonder what some of the long-term implications are and what is the scale that the pandemic has had and continues to exert on education systems worldwide?
Well, thanks very much for this opportunity to discuss this important issue. Indeed, at the height of the pandemic, 1.6 billion learners had their education disrupted. That was last May. These are numbers that would have been unthinkable. That's over 90% of the global student bodies had those children had their schooling disrupted. Even to today, we have over 800 million children whose schooling remains closed. So an unprecedented challenge, and indeed has short and long-term impacts. So with the closure of schools, we have a number of impacts on children that we're very concerned about. First of all, I do want to mention it is disproportionate impact on marginalized children. So UNICEF, as well as many other organizations and governments, are working very hard to reach marginalized children, in particular with remote learning and enabling them to continue to learn. But because the pandemic has gone on for so long and the disruption of schooling has gone on for so long, indeed, there has been profound impact on the learning of children, including learning loss, but also on their psychosocial and mental health. We are increasingly concerned that children feel isolated. They no longer are in their routines. They aren't interacting with their peers, with their teachers, etc. And that is having also a very worrying impact on many children.
Now, throughout the pandemic, the experts from the UNICEF, including yourself, have been warning governments and countries against a lost year in children's education. Now, reflecting back on what has happened and where we stand right now, how do we avoid lasting damage to the future of the children?
So while schools are closed, it's important to continue to work in partnership with all of us to ensure children continue to learn and continue to feel connected. So we have been employing a full range of technology from high sort of levels of IT-enabled technology, world-class digital tools, internet-enabled learning, all the way through the television, the radio, and low-tech or no-tech solutions like supporting teachers to deliver learning materials to home. So that is one key, continues to be a challenge in many situations and one key area of focus. As schools are planning for reopening and are reopening, and we're very encouraged by schools reopening around the world, we're learning a lot of lessons on how to do that reopening process effectively. One key lesson has been to focus on marginalized children to ensure that after such an extended period, marginalized children return to school. Secondly, to ensure that as schools reopen, comprehensive support is provided to children, not only catch them where they are in their learning and accelerate their learning through remedial classes and catch-up classes, but also provide a sense of safety, reach them with their comprehensive support, including psychosocial support and mental support, also nutritional support and other key issues where with schools closed, that full range of services were interrupted. The third also is as children return to school, we need to work with the education system as a whole to transform the learning. See, I do want to just wrap up by saying on this answer by saying the world was experiencing a global learning crisis before the pandemic. And so now with this disruption and with this pause, as schools reopen, we're trying to seize the opportunity to leapfrog education in many countries, so that indeed we don't return to the learning crisis that the world was experiencing before the pandemic.
Now, experts and educators have spoken about the increased risk of dropouts amid the pandemic, and adolescent girls and children from marginalized groups and vulnerable families face an even greater risk of never returning to schools even after the pandemic. While schools are reopening and we're finding new solutions to approaching education, how do we make sure that no one is left out?
Well, that's a key question. I'm really glad that we're discussing it, because one thing the pandemic and the disruption the pandemic has had on education has done is it's shone a spotlight on the disparities that were existing. And indeed, marginalized, vulnerable children are experiencing this pandemic very differently, and therefore require concerted efforts and resources to address the challenges they face. So we are seeing around the world, within each community, children, marginalized children, children that live in poor households. You mentioned adolescent girls are facing particular risks during this time. We have children who have disabilities, children who live, their mother tongue is not offered in the school system, so they're from minority groups. These are examples of characteristics of children that correlate with marginalization or vulnerability, and concerted effort then to address those challenges that those children face to bridge them back into school is absolutely critical.
Mr. Jenkins, the fourth goal of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations is ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education for all starting from 2030. How big of a setback is the pandemic to reaching this critical aim?
So, we were actually off track to reach the Sustainable Development Goal number 4 prior to the pandemic. So we were looking at ways of accelerating progress. And then indeed the disruption caused by the pandemic has been a further setback. I would say in 2 ways. One is, and you mentioned it before, the risk of increasing dropouts, or more children to be out of school after the pandemic due to increasing dropouts. It has been estimated that 24 million additional children are at risk of dropping out due to the disruption of the pandemic. So that indeed is a setback. The second is, even as children return, and if they do come back to school with proactive support, like I've been discussing, they all around the world, children have experienced a learning loss. So now what's critical is being proactive to overcome the barriers for children to return to school, and as they return to school, to accelerate learning, to provide catch-up programs, to provide comprehensive support to each child, so that indeed they can be regain onto their learning pathway and be successful.
Mr. Jenkins, thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
After speaking to Robert Jenkins, I decided to meet with the representative of the Unicef here in Kazakhstan, Arthur Van Diesen, to help me better understand how children, parents, teachers, and educators are coping with the new norm a year into the pandemic. Mr. Van Diesen, you and I met a year ago and discussed how schools would reopen in September and how the UNICEF had prepared recommendations to the reopening of the schools. However, a year into the pandemic, more than 4 million children in Kazakhstan are out of the classrooms. How would you describe the past year?
Well, it's definitely been a turbulent year. And I think we were all hoping that the process of normalization in the education sector would be a lot more rapid than it has been. It's been a tough year with lots of twists and turns, right? Because, of course, government has tried very hard to reopen schools where it was safe to do so. But there have been many instances where, due to the epidemiological situation, it has been necessary to send children home again for them to learn remotely. So for children, it's been a tough year in terms of education. A year with lots of uncertainties, a year with lots of changes. Now, the great thing is, of course, that children are very resilient, and it's amazing to see how children adapt to changes very quickly. But of course, the impact in terms of learning differs a lot for different children. So it differs a lot depending on your socioeconomic status. So do you actually have the means to study meaningfully in your home location? It also depends on whether you have special educational needs for children with special learning needs. For children with disabilities, of course, it's much harder to learn remotely. It depends a lot on where you live as well. If you live in a remote rural area with poor connectivity, it's actually very tough to join an online class. I think we've all seen those pictures of children climbing on a roof to catch an internet signal so they can be part of their lesson. That, of course, is very challenging. So that's really something that as Unicef we've been emphasizing, that the impact of this education crisis, because I think the COVID crisis is also an education crisis, has been very different depending on the circumstances of the child. So what's become very clear to us is that in working with the Ministry of Education, we really need to make sure that education remains accessible and remains of good quality for children in whatever situations they face. That's a big challenge.
Let's talk about the groups of children have higher barriers to education. Or who are these children?
Well, I would say first and foremost the children with poor connectivity. Kazakhstan is a huge country, and there are still many pockets in the country where internet accessibility is not available. There's no access. Or where it's very poor, very low speed. So if you live in an area like that, of course you're already set back. Children with, from relatively less wealthy families, from poorer families, also face difficulties because they may not have the means to get online, they may not have the means to keep following the lessons that are offered remotely. Then I would say children with disabilities, and that's one big category that we're particularly concerned about because, of course, in an inclusive education setting in a school, they would have the support that they need in order for them to keep up with the learning process. When they're learning from a home location, that's very difficult for them. Other than that, I would also highlight the plight of children in migration processes, for example. They are at a particular setback as well when it comes to following education, and these changes also do not benefit them. So there's a whole range of different categories of children who are more at risk, and this crisis and the need to close schools has been a setback for all children, but it has deepened educational inequalities. It's hit those children who are already at risk of not doing so well at school, has hit them harder.
Now, obviously, changes in education have changed families, have directly impacted each family who has children. Women are opting out of the workforce more and more and going back to their traditional roles, especially in families with younger children who cannot learn independently and organize themselves independently. And households with a single parent are also struggling at the moment. How do you think that affects our society moving forward?
Yeah, I think you've touched a very important point there. I think the gendered impact of COVID-19 is something that's very important, and that has had major impacts on individual women, but also on families. Mm-hmm. So as you say, of course, when you are dealing with childcare, your children are at home, schools are closed, it's very difficult to do your job. In some companies, it is possible to work remotely. You have all the resources you need to do that, but of course for many women that is not a reality, right? So they are forced into prolonged leave or may even lose their jobs. And I think, of course, it's also been really important for women to keep their jobs, right? So what I see as well is an increase in time poverty, I would call it. Mm-hmm. So women who are working tend to now shift their working pattern, right? So in the daytime, they're mainly dealing with childcare, helping their children to learn remotely. And then when they have time later in the day and during the night, they actually do their day job. Mm-hmm. That's not a sustainable situation, of course. As the economy is picking up again, I think we're seeing that it's mainly men who are returning to their jobs and women are staying at home. So that's a setback. It impacts poverty levels as well. And on that, actually, the evidence is becoming clearer as well. The economic impact at the family level of COVID-19 is becoming clearer and clearer. And I think it's much larger than anyone had expected. Mm-hmm. We've run some projections ourselves here at Unicef. And in terms of child poverty, according to different scenarios, we think that in 2020, child poverty may have risen between 10 to 20 percentage points. Mm-hmm. And the important point is as well that when you roll that out further into the future, when you do projections for 2021, 2022, even in 2022, we won't have recovered back to the level of 2019. So the impact is severe, and it lasts over a long time. We have some evidence from families who are now beginning to say, well, we've exhausted our savings, for example, right? We had a buffer, but as a result of this crisis, which is now going on for a year, we've run out of savings. We're behind on our utility bills. We can't sometimes afford the basics anymore in terms of food, even. In a country like Kazakhstan, that's quite shocking. So the economic impact is quite severe, and of course, that hits children as well.
As schools are planning to reopen, and hopefully vaccination will be the key factor affecting and making it possible sooner than later, what are the UNICEF's recommendations to reopening schools?
Well, in general, what we've been saying is that schools should be among the first institutions that reopen, because there are simply so many disadvantages that children face, and it's so difficult to ensure quality education remotely that really this is critical. It's critical from a learning point of view, but it's critical from lots of other points of view as well, because a school is also a place where children have their relations with their friends, etc. It's incredibly important for mental health. It's important to an extent even for nutrition, because children get school meals as well. So for all these reasons, it's critical that schools are opened as quickly as possible. But of course, schools have to open in a safe manner. What we've been advocating for a long time globally is that the decisions on school opening should be taken in a localized manner, depending on the capacity of these schools to open safely with all the safety measures in place, but also the local epidemiological situation and the capacity of the health sector. So obviously, if you're in a location where the virus is running wild, all your ICU beds are occupied, schools are not able to open safely, they don't have the ability to distance children, then it might not be a good idea. But you may have another location in the same country where it's entirely possible. So we've been advocating for these evidence-based and localized decisions that make it possible for children to return to school. And I'm very glad that government in Kazakhstan has actually moved in that direction. So it is not saying all schools are closed throughout the country. It's a much more localized and evidence-based decision that they're reaching now, which is a good thing.
You and I also spoke about some of the opportunities that need to be seized during this crisis last year, and one of them was the Giga project that aims to ensure broadband internet across Kazakhstan, even to the remote areas. How is the project progressing?
Thanks for that question, and indeed, connectivity has come to the fore as one of the key issues in all of this. And I'm very glad to say that there's a lot of interest in the connectivity agenda now in Kazakhstan. I think there was a bit of a feeling before this crisis happened that Kazakhstan was way ahead of everyone, and there was, yes, maybe some residual issues, but basically the connectivity issue was solved for Kazakhstan. I think what the past year has shown is that even in Kazakhstan there's a long way to go. And what is good is that government as well as the private sector are actively looking for opportunities to improve things. And that's very encouraging. Now, in terms of the Giga project, as I told you last time, the very first step in that is mapping every school in the country and determining whether they are connected or not. That work has been finished for Kazakhstan. We're now taking the next step in terms of looking at connectivity speeds, because of course it's one thing to be connected, it's another thing to be connected at a speed that will actually allow you to access the learning content that you need. And then we're pushing forward with government and the private sector to find innovative solutions, and innovation both in terms of technology and in terms of financing. The challenge, of course, is huge in a country like Kazakhstan because it is such a vast territory, and traditional technologies of running a fiber optic cable are so expensive that they're basically unaffordable. Now, it's great, therefore, that the government is also actively looking into new directions. There's a wonderful scheme that government has set up with mobile network operators, where mobile network operators actually get a discount on the frequency use, and that's done on the condition that they then reinvest that into infrastructure development. That's the kind of innovative financing solution that we're advocating for. Also, in terms of technological innovation, I know there are conversations ongoing between the government of Kazakhstan and some of the operators of low-orbit satellites, for example. That's a new technology that isn't yet accessible in Kazakhstan. That would really help us make a huge leap forward, because it brings a new technology that actually helps us to reach many more children with broadband internet. And there are more of these technologies that can be applied here. So all of that is promising, but there is a long way to go still.
Mr. Van Diesen, thank you.
Thank you.